Less than a decade after the guns have gone silent over the Korean peninsula, a new era of the Cold War begins. This time between the two greatest powers of the communist world, China and the Soviet Union. Frustrated by an unequal relationship is China's supreme leader, Mao Zedong. Mao's ambition to put China on the world stage would shape her transformation as a nation. But it would create an irreparable rift with the Soviet Union, one that would break out into open war. For so long, China's bitter rivalry with the Soviet Union has been shrouded in secrecy. Now, eyewitness accounts from PLA soldiers reveal a conflict that has been brewing since the beginning of the Sino-Soviet alliance. This is the untold story of Mao's Cold War with the Soviet Union. March 1969. On a tiny island in the Ussuri River between China and the Soviet Union, war has broken out. 19-year-old Wang Lianqi is about to face an enemy once considered China's closest ally.
我叫王连起，今年62岁。1969年2月6号，我离开了大连，就直接来到了牡丹江，在23军67师201团新兵连。哎呀，整个船团真是群情激愤，要我们执行公用任务，执行什么任务呢？我们不知道，但是我们大家纷纷猜测，可能要上珍宝岛了。
In the most dramatic turn in state-to-state relations in the Cold War, China and the Soviet Union are at war at Zhenbao Island. The quarrel, 1.5 million square kilometers of land that Tsarist Russia took from China nearly 100 years ago, and the current demarcation of the Sino-Soviet border now, the war zone, Zhenbao Island in the Ussuri River. It lies within hundreds of meters of both Chinese and Soviet military camps. Both sides consider the island theirs. As the conflict quickly escalates, China's top leader takes action. Party chairman Mao Zedong. With the capital Beijing only a day away from the war zone, Mao fears Soviet tanks will soon roll in across China's flat plains. He orders a surge of soldiers to fight the superior Soviet strike force. Barely 1 month after his enlistment, Wang is sent to the front line on Zhenbao.
当时我们心情是非常的激动和高兴。当时我记得老团长当时是泪流满面，说自从我们建团以来，主席亲自对我们团进行批示，这是头一次，这是对我们最大的信任，最大的鼓舞。但是呢，有一条，对战争的残酷性，对估计，还是非常幼稚的。
The Chinese army scores a triumph with the capture of a Soviet T-62 tank, a superior weapon that has never been in Chinese hands. The prize would fuel Mao's drive to build a modern army, enabling engineers to design China's very own battle tanks within years. But Mao's thirst for Soviet technology had its roots 20 years earlier in 1949, when China and the Soviet Union were still allies. October 1949. The newly established People's Republic of China looks to the Soviet Union to help transform it into a world power.
In 1949, when PRC was founded, China was extremely weak, very poor, and the Soviet Union was in a much better shape in terms of industrial development, economic development, military capability, and political influence in the world.
3 months later, in 1950, the Russian leader signs a treaty of friendship. Secretary General Joseph Stalin. The terms of the treaty, however, would be tilted against China's favor. This plants the seeds of mistrust. Almost all of the Soviets' loans under the treaty would be for the purchase of Soviet arms. In addition, the treaty gives the Soviets exclusive access to Xinjiang's and Manchuria's economies. Mao finds China caught in an unequal relationship.
So from the beginning of the establishment of the PRC, Stalin is making the point that you're the junior partner, emphasize junior. And Mao is immediately beginning to calculate the potential repercussions of this. And he's conflicted there. I mean, on the one hand, yes, I need what the Soviets can provide, and I genuinely admire Stalin. On the other hand, you can't treat us like this. We're China, and we may have been down, but we're not going to be soon.
Soon after signing the Sino-Soviet treaty, Mao finds a chance to gain his edge over Stalin. Later the same year, in June 1950, war breaks out in Korea between the Soviet-backed North and American-backed South. Unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the US, Stalin requests for Mao to intervene. Mao decides to play the situation to China's advantage. He demands that Stalin provide military aid as well as air cover for his troops. He hopes this war will be an equal partnership. 4 months later, in 1950, Stalin agrees to send military equipment to China. But he insists that China take the lead in the fighting.
朝鲜战争爆发应该是一直到10月份，中国出兵之前，就这10个月，你看他们来来往往的电报，这个毛泽东说的每一句话，斯大林都不敢相信。直到毛泽东决定中国出兵，单独和美国作战。这个斯大林呢，他不知道中国是真的是假的，哎，他说你先去，啊，你打2个月，2个半月我再上。就在这种情况下，毛咬着牙，行，我先去。
With an uneasy compromise reached, Mao orders over 250,000 troops into Korea. Stalin deploys airplanes to China's northeast to defend her coastal regions. But Stalin stops short. He decides not to send planes to Korea. Mao's outgunned army faces the UN war machine alone.
Clearly, the Chinese leaders were disappointed by the Soviet decision. And it was one of the arguments that Mao expressed later on with the Soviet leaders, that Moscow simply betrayed China.
As a stalemate sets in over Korea, Mao pressures Stalin for aid to develop China's own military capabilities. Stalin agrees to send more ammunition, but holds off on the transfer of military technology. Stalin and Mao's rivalry hits a deadlock, but events would soon take an unexpected turn. The 5th of March, 1953. China is embroiled in the Korean War. But a shocking event turns the course of the war. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin dies from a cerebral hemorrhage. The new Soviet leadership urges Mao to end the Korean War. Within months, a ceasefire is called. But the experience of the Korean War casts a shadow over Sino-Soviet relations. The Soviets' failure to deliver many of its promises of military support during the war convinces Mao that China has to become self-sufficient. Later that year, Mao unleashes a 5-year plan to increase China's industrial output. He is determined to transform China into a power no one, not even the Soviet Union, can afford to ignore.
Now, Stalin was gone. There was no need for Mao to be fearful of the Soviet Union. And it sort of really lifted the cover of many other factors. When Stalin was alive, Mao couldn't reveal his personal political ambitions. But now there's no, reservation or hesitation for Mao to compete for political influence in the socialist world.
When Stalin was alive, Mao had to yield to his reputation and authority. But now Mao sees the chance to dominate Stalin's successor, Premier Nikita Khrushchev. One year later, in 1954, Khrushchev visits Beijing for the 5th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. He offers many gifts to the young nation, including loans that Mao is hungry for. Khrushchev even agrees to return Soviet bases in Port Arthur to China, a major sticking point of the Sino-Soviet relations since 1950.
其实呢，毛泽东开始是挺喜欢赫鲁晓夫的。一个就是赫鲁晓夫这个人性情比较直率，说该说说，该笑笑，该骂就骂，不是那么，就是让人不可琢磨那样子的。第二个呢，就是赫鲁晓夫这人学问不高，他原以为赫鲁晓夫没经验，不懂哲学，他教育教育就跟着中国走就完了嘛，这事儿。结果没想到赫鲁晓夫不听。
2 years later, in 1956, Khrushchev does the unforgivable. At the Soviet Union's 20th Party Congress, he denounces Stalin's personality cult and excesses. Khrushchev's move is unprecedented. The rule of Stalin has never been questioned, not even by Mao.
In the minds of a lot of Chinese leaders, including Mao, Stalin was a godlike political figure, even though Mao had a lot of unpleasant relationship with Stalin during Mao's revolution.
Mao himself, as we know, became Stalin in China. He enjoyed personality cult absolute control and political power. Now in 1956-57, when Khrushchev said Stalin was wrong, Mao could not accept. So Mao began to criticize Khrushchev, call him revisionist, new Russian imperialist leader, betraying the communist movement.
To make matters worse, Khrushchev puts forward his concept of peaceful coexistence with the West. He believes that capitalism will fall apart from its own excesses. But Mao believes de-Stalinization will bring down the communist world, dragging China down with it.
You are telling the Western world that the communist system had flaws. Before that, in the Cold War between the West and the East, there was contention, there was rivalry for the merits of political system. So de-Stalinization led to the effect that it weakens the socialist war's legitimacy and the moral, political sense of superiority. So Mao was worried about that.
Within months, Mao sends a veiled challenge to Khrushchev. He declares that Stalin's serious mistake was not to treat the Chinese as equals. But he maintains that Stalin, without doubt, was a good Marxist. By implying that Khrushchev's denunciations of Stalin were brash, Mao subtly positions himself as Khrushchev's superior. But Mao's ambitions would soon result in serious consequences for China. He begins drastic measures to overtake the Soviet Union in what would terrifyingly become known as the Great Leap Forward. In 1958, Mao unleashes the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious project to transform China into a modern state through rapid industrialization. It's fueled by a drive to rid China of its dependency on the Soviet Union. A Soviet Union that Mao thinks is distancing itself too far from its communist roots.
最主要的一个考虑，就是要通过这种群众运动的方式，把中国的经济这个水平迅速提高，摆脱这个依赖外援、依赖苏联的这种状况，甚至它要超过苏联。
But with masses of labor diverted to steel production, there aren't enough people to farm the land. With no food, severe famines spread across China over the next 3 years. It is catastrophic. A combination of famine and overwork killed 38 million people. A death toll unprecedented in history.
The Great Leap Forward was not a rational decision-making. It was not based on, expertise. It was simply political decision and very emotional sort of decision-making.
Instead of claiming responsibility, Mao officially names the period the 3 years of natural disasters and blames the famine on unfair Soviet policies. The perception of the Soviet blame for the famine still lives on today. Veteran Gao Xingchun grew up during the Great Leap Forward.
不知道你知道3年自然灾害不？卡脖子要我们还债，这一切我们都经历了。 我小的时候呢，苹果捞不到吃啊。我们大连地区是出水果的呀，却吃不到苹果，而且呢，只过年过节能吃到。听说大部分的水果都要还债了，还给苏联，还债了。我们粮食供应啊，是供应不上来的，哎。
When Khrushchev hears of the devastation, he openly challenges Mao.
Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders, they thought Mao was crazy. It's completely unrealistic, completely utopian. So you are destroying your own society and the country. So Mao was very angry when he came to know those kind of Soviet perspective of his approach to communism.
1 year later, in 1960, Mao bites back at the Romanian Party Congress. In front of the communist world, Mao denounces Khrushchev as a revisionist. Khrushchev retaliates by withdrawing all Soviet experts and aid from China. The Sino-Soviet fallout is now in the open. 2 years later, in 1962, the ideological rift worsens. A crisis in Cuba involving the Soviets erupts. The Soviets have been secretly building nuclear missile bases in Cuba. The US responds with a naval blockade of the island. The crisis quickly escalates, throwing the world to the brink of nuclear war. In a rare gesture, China offers full support for the Soviet Union. But for Mao, Khrushchev does the unthinkable. He reaches a compromise with US President John F. Kennedy and agrees to dismantle missile bases in Cuba.
苏联希望中国在古巴导弹危机上支持他一把，因为中国是个大国，是吧？他这种道义上的舆论上的支持还是很重要的。但是中国没有这样做，不但没这样做，反而批判苏联，说你这个一开始是冒险主义，谁让你往美国后院送这个导弹呢？那么要送了就坚持到底。
Mao condemns Khrushchev for what he terms cowardice in the Caribbean. Khrushchev retaliates by severing all ties with China. He also condemns China's nuclear arms program. The breakdown in Sino-Soviet alliance is now complete. Two years later, in 1964, the Sino-Soviet split takes an unexpected twist. Khrushchev's own protégés oust him from power. The new supreme leader of the Soviet Union, Secretary General Leonid Brezhnev. Mao sends a delegation to Moscow in 1965 in the hope of reviving the Sino-Soviet alliance. But the Chinese delegation get a rude shock at the Soviet reception.
马林诺夫斯基他是个国防部长，原来苏联远东军的司令。这个小子就喝多了，他跟贺龙说，中苏关系本来是很好的，我们就像亲兄弟一样。后来就是毛泽东跟赫鲁晓夫他们两个人不对付，他们俩人搞不来。说现在我们已经把赫鲁晓夫干掉了，你们回去把毛泽东干掉不就完了吗？咱们两国就和好了。
When the incident reaches Mao's ears, he decides there can be no reconciliation. But all is not lost for Mao. He plans on turning this incident to his favor. Using the excuse that the Soviets are attempting to sow discord in China, Mao makes a deadly move. The year is 1966. Using the excuse the Soviets are attempting to sow discord in China, Mao unleashes the Cultural Revolution. It's a terrifying campaign to purge his enemies at all levels of society. Mao begins targeting the top ranks of the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. He denounces his enemies as Soviet revisionists. Veteran Gao Xingchen bears witness to the turmoil.
部队呢，这个受到冲击了，文化大革命受到造反派的一些冲击。咱们大连地区也可能呢，别的地区都有啊，军队受到了冲击。那时候还抢枪啊，到部队来抢枪，造反派啊，哎，要保护好武器。
The fervor of the Cultural Revolution further escalates the Sino-Soviet conflict. It brings all of China's misgivings over its unfair relationship with the Soviets to crisis point. The long-standing offense, 1.5 million square kilometers of land that Tsarist Russia had taken from China in the 19th century. This territorial issue becomes a nationalistic flashpoint.
More intense the Cultural Revolution became, the more superheated the rhetoric became about the century of humiliation. And while Taiwan was the #1 unredeemed issue, right behind it was the northern border, and that was the Soviet Union. So you have the old friction with Russia now being grafted onto the new, quite intense friction with the Soviet Union. Dangerous overheating of that relationship.
Thousands of Chinese besiege the Soviet embassy in Beijing. Groups even gather along China's border with the Soviet Union to shout insults at Soviet guards. The Cultural Revolution convinces Soviet leader Brezhnev China must be contained. Brezhnev deploys 1 million troops to the country's shared borders. China retaliates by doing the same. It is the most dramatic turn in state-to-state relations in the Cold War. Professor Li Xiaobin served in the army during the time. He remembers the sudden hostility.
We had morning drills, practice. We used the Americans as our shooting target. We paint the target as a Nixon, big nose, blue eyes, because we were told Americans coming. We need to prepare the war against America. All of a sudden, we don't know why, we were told Americans not coming, but the Russians will. So we had to change the shooting target, not Nixon, but Brezhnev, Russians coming. So we began to prepare war against the Soviet Union.
With increased patrols on both sides, conflicts break out. These are the archives Chinese officials release. They show Soviet troops harassing Chinese guards at the border. Chinese media also reports a Soviet tank running over Chinese protesters. Chinese fishermen are also harassed. But historical records reveal both sides committed offenses. With tensions running at an all-time high, it will only take one misstep for both sides to break out into a full-scale war. The 2nd of March, 1969. One of the most tense points along the border is a small island less than 2.5 kilometers long. Zhenbao Island is situated in the Ussuri River to the east of Heilongjiang province. It sits within hundreds of meters of both Soviet and Chinese military camps. Western and Soviet scholars say that under Mao's explicit orders, Chinese soldiers ambush Soviet border guards here. The Soviets say over 60 of their soldiers are killed. But China's official tone is that the Soviets opened fire first. Fearing a full-scale war, Mao sends more soldiers to Zhenbao. Wang Lianqi is one of thousands who receive Mao's order.
1969年3月8号，我们连呢乘着汽车呢，就到了珍宝岛战区。在这个时候，对我们最大的威胁是什么？是一种严寒。白天，我们有观察哨在山上，进行观测，但是到了晚间，我们就要偷偷地摸到，苏军库里比亚克以内哨所的底下，鼻子底下进行侦查。
1 week later, on the 15th of March 1969, the Soviet Union launches a full-scale attack. They bombard the island with heavy artillery. Spearheading their land assault is a devastating weapon. The T-62 battle tank, a weapon that has never been in Chinese hands. For the PLA veterans, it was an impossible fight against the overwhelming Soviet war machine.
这辆坦克具有红外线的这个夜间标准区，红外线夜间射击，捕捉目标协警，当时是很先进的。
其实我们部队啊，在上前线的时候，我们武器装备并不好。轻武器呢，就是一个班2支AK-47，其他的战士都是半自动步枪。
但炮火最激烈的一天呢，是4月11号。开始我也不知道怎么回事，整整打了一宿。但坦克炮呢，红外线一闪，肯定来了，也就5到7秒钟，直射炮，非常快。 但有点确实在前面爆炸的时候，有的时候就撒一嘴啊，嘴里面全是那个连血、带冰、带土，经常是那样的。
But in a huge moral victory, the Chinese army managed to capture one Soviet T-62 tank. They're ordered to protect it at all cost. But the Soviets launch an all-out attack to recapture their tank, resulting in devastating consequences. Barely 2 days after their first offensive, the Soviet Union launches another attack. Their goal this time, the sophisticated T-62 tank that is now in Chinese hands. Gao Xingchen is tasked to protect China's war prize at all costs.
黑龙江的4月已经是冰化的季节了，这种冰化呢，它就下去了，冰一疏，江一化，这辆坦克就掉到了江里。掉到江里以后呢，我们团命令2营5连执行这个任务。 这个整个拉坦克是很危险的，老毛子呢就想把这辆坦克给炸了，他们还派了一个小分队，过来呢炸这个坦克，炸毁这个坦克，被我们发现，给他击退了。但是他呢天天打炮，就要把这个坦克要炸毁。
The The Soviets failed to recapture the tank, but their missiles hit other targets with devastating results. More than 800 Chinese are killed as the Soviets relentlessly bombard Zhenbao for months. Their missiles even reached 20 kilometers into China as the Soviets try to wrestle Zhenbao from Chinese control. For veteran Wang Liangqi, the front line remains fraught with danger.
3月15号、3月17号两场重大的战斗结束之后呢，其实它的战争状态并没有结束。我们连队在1969年5月份就全面接手了珍宝岛。所以珍宝岛的整个防御全部由我们连进行防御。这时候呢，苏军呢，对我珍宝岛每天的炮击和射击都没有停止，啊，隔三差五啊，就进行打炮，每天都进行射击。
As stalemate sets in over Zhenbao Island, another flashpoint develops. This time on a part along the Sino-Soviet border, more than 6,000 kilometers away, at the border zone of Tie-le-Kurti along Xinjiang province. August the 13th, 1969. Chinese frontier troops patrol Tie-le-Kurti. A Soviet task force responds with deadly force. They kill the entire patrol and occupy the Chinese border zone. The Soviets are further hardening their attitude towards China.
珍宝岛这个事儿，我认为对苏联和中国的心理影响比较大，就是他真的把你当头号敌人了。苏联开始不知道中国到底要干什么，以为是不是要试探一下，完了就全面进攻。
As the border war stretches into months, Soviet leader Brezhnev considers a drastic measure to end the Chinese threat: a nuclear strike. The threat of nuclear war now hangs heavily over China. The Soviets' nuclear capability far exceeds China's. In Beijing, Mao orders the construction of an underground bunker city against a nuclear fallout. Professor Shen is a 19-year-old soldier in the army at the time. He remembers the tension in Beijing.
珍宝岛战争发生以后，中国的确是这个全国动员，做这个防止核战争的准备。当时我们在部队的时候，也都是挖那个，每个人都挖一个洞，叫毛耳洞，说一打那边一打，你就钻进去就没事儿了。这个城市里头都是挖这个地洞啊。
Thousands of Chinese build a labyrinth of bomb shelters, stretching almost entirely under the capital city. China's Cold War with the Soviet Union now reaches crisis point. As the Soviets consider carrying out a nuclear strike on China to end a border war, they receive a dire warning. US President Richard Nixon threatens retaliation if the Soviets carry out a nuclear attack. Nixon states that such an attack will be a declaration of World War III. His hardline approach dashes Moscow's plans for a decisive strike against China. More importantly, it changes the game entirely, bringing the Cold War into a new era.
So now the game changed. The game of the Cold War changed from a two poles, a bipolar system, to a triangle system. Now Nixon introduced new player, China, to the Cold War. So there was triangle, three poles, China, United States, and the Soviet Union.
When the US threatens to retaliate against a nuclear attack on China, the Soviet Union is forced to assess its strategy. The 11th of September, 1969. Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin meets his Chinese counterpart, Zhao Enlai, to defuse the conflict. With the frosty relations, the two meet only at Beijing airport. They agree to begin border negotiations. By the next year, hostilities cease along the Sino-Soviet border due to the negotiations. But it would take nearly 20 years before both sides find a settlement to the border issue. On the 9th of September 1976, Mao dies, ending nearly 27 years of his total rule over China. A huge shift in relations occurs inside and outside China. His legacy, however, is immortal.
当时叫一不怕苦二不怕死，这是老人家说的，毛泽东主席说的。可以说当时来讲呢，这两把劲不仅影响了我们这一代，也影响了今后几代，至今它仍然在发挥着作用。所以这一不怕苦二不怕死啊，那不是个单纯一个口号，那是中华民族的传统，中华民族的精神，更是中华民族的文明。
Since the beginning of Sino-Soviet relations, Mao's ambitions for China set the alliance on a dangerous path. But from the ashes of a war-torn country, shamed by a century of humiliation, Mao was hugely influential in shaping a fiercely patriotic nation and superpower. With the decline of communism worldwide, China is now redefining its role as a leader on the world stage.